little bit of a cold, but that's all it is a cold. There was some notes out. If you wanted to take notes, I do always put the notes out for the sermon, so there are some out there if you didn't get one. A couple of things going on this week. Of course, I'm headed out tomorrow to Warner Robins, so I'm going to go down to the Georgia Baptist Convention. So you guys pray that's a good convention. I'm going to be down there for the next couple of days. Get to take part in signing people up, and get voted in on the executive committee and all kinds of fun stuff. So looking forward to that. And always Monday night's a fun night because we get to hear a bunch of good preaching. So looking forward to that. But just be in prayer for our Georgia Baptist Convention next couple of days. I appreciate that. Also, as we've talked about, today is Veterans Day, and I'm always amazed because if you remember, I was thinking about starting in Colossians and was going to preach from there, but I just couldn't get peace about that. And finally, and I can't even tell you why God led me to the book of Ruth, which we've been doing a series in now. This is our third Sunday in our series, Gleanings from Ruth. And, as I was doing that and thinking about that, I thought, well, this week's Veterans Day, next week's Thanksgiving. And, amazing thing is the sermon really talks a lot today about a labor of love. That's our sermon title this morning is, start off by reading the first few verses, and then as we go, we'll look at the other verses. But today, you could go ahead and turn over into the book of Ruth. We'll be looking at a labor of love, and we'll be starting with the very last verse of chapter 1, and we're going to go all the way through to verse 23 of chapter 2. So we're covering that whole chapter this morning. And yes, I'll try my best to get done on time. So I know it's hard for you to believe that I might actually finish a whole chapter, but it can happen. Miracles do happen, right? But remember, just because Naomi's not a central theme in this part of the story doesn't take her out of the story. We call the book Ruth, and Ruth's an important character in it. But do you realize that the book of Ruth is really all about Naomi? It's really all about Naomi, and we lose sight of that sometimes because the Old Testament was talking about who? It was talking about God's nation, the nation of Israel, and who was the key person there in that passage of the nation of Israel. It was Naomi. And you'll see as we go through that Naomi is really the central theme of Ruth. Seems a little strange, but that's the case. But she's not the central theme in today's story, but she is a very key part of the book of Ruth. And as we look at this day, don't forget that our central theme for the entire series is this: God honors our good choices and our commitments. God honors those. So if there's one thing you need to learn from Ruth, it's that. We need to make good choices in our lives, and we need to make commitments in our life. And God honors those. God blesses those. And so that's really what the book of Ruth is about. So don't lose sight of that as we go through this book. And as I said, I've called today's sermon a labor of love, which speaks of all the characters that's involved in today's story. And when I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about Veterans Day, because, I'll be honest with you, bad on my part, but I never realized until yesterday that Veterans Day was actually going to fall on a Sunday. I didn't realize that till yesterday because it always is November the 11th. And so I didn't realize that it was going to fall on a Sunday. And then, so I started thinking about that, and I thought, well, this really fits in because it talks about service, which is in commitment, and a labor of love, we're looking at this labor of love because you see, God gave us the first example of a labor of love because his labor of love was to send Jesus Christ to live and to come in human form and to die on the cross. That was God's labor of love. But we in turn must do a labor of love unto God, following his example and to others. And that's what we're going to see this morning in these verses. So I'm going to read through that last verse of chapter 1, and then I'm going to read the first 7 verses of chapter 2 as we get started this morning. So if you're to the book of Ruth, go ahead and stand with me, and we'll read the rest as we go along this morning, okay? So here's what it has to say. And again, we're starting in verse 22 of chapter 1. So Naomi returned, and Ruth, the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now, they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. There was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth and of the family of Elimelech, name was Boaz. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean heads and grain after him in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. Then she left, and she went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he had said to his reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servants, who was in charge of the reaper, whose young woman is this? So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, it is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little while in the house. Dear Heavenly Father, as we look into your word this morning, we look at the labor of love that you gave to us, and then such a labor of love that Ruth was willing to give for her mother-in-law, Naomi, and the labor of love that Boaz was willing to give unto Ruth. Lord, we realize that as your servants, we should be giving a labor of love to others and unto you. So God, I just pray as we go through this scripture this morning, you speak to us, you help us to understand what it is that we're to do as your servants. And God, again, we just are so thankful for those veterans who are willing to serve our country, but God, more than that, willing to serve you as well. Lord, just allow your Holy Spirit to speak into the lives of those that's here this morning and to spread the gospel message to those who's outside these four walls. For we ask these things in your name. Amen. The book of Ruth was very significant to the Jewish people, and still today is very significant to the Jewish people. Why? Because it was the lineage for the Messiah. And so even though many Jewish people today still think the Messiah is to come, we know better, and many Jewish people, Messianic Jews, also know better. So to them, Ruth really has a great meaning. But what I want you to, we need to understand this. That's evident, I would think, if you look at some of our laws of our land today. We don't do a good job of it. So God set in place some ways to live by. One of those things was very important. It was about taking care of those who couldn't take care of themselves. And so we get this Levitical law. We get it from Leviticus 19, 9 through 10. And it was a Levitical law that was in effect a welfare system for the widows and poor persons. The law required that only one pass be made through the fields, and the remaining grain of fruit could be gleaned by the poor. Here's what it says in those verses. It said, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, and you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. That was the Levitical law that was given. That's important for us to understand what's going on today in these verses in chapter 2 of Ruth. So not only did this help Naomi and Ruth because of their impoverished situation, because remember, they came back. And at that time period, because even though Naomi was a widow to Elimelech, her land didn't pass. It only passed from male to male. So right now, her land is open property where she's staying. It no longer necessarily remains in her name. And we find out as we go along in Ruth, you have to have a redeemer, a kinsman redeemer, and we see that picture of Boaz, and we'll be talking about that. But right now, she has no clue whether she's going to be able to keep that land or who's going to get that land, whether she's going to be able to stay or anything. She does not know. So you see, the fact that this law was in place was very key to them because they were impoverished. They had come back. They had nothing. And so they had to depend on this law to gather their food. But what was even neater than that is Ruth was a Moabite. So it didn't just talk about the Jewish people. What it talked about a stranger or a foreigner as well. So for Ruth, it was doubly important. It was her way. She could stay to her commitment to provide for Naomi, but also this law included that stranger or that foreigner. So it was doubly important to her. So we see that in this scripture this morning. And what's amazing is you need to stop and think. When was the book of Ruth written? What time period was it? It was the time of the judges. And it was the time that Israel kept turning their back on God. And were not following his laws. So even though this law was given to them, they weren't necessarily following this law. So the key important part was that she went to Boaz's field. Very important. Not just because it ended up he was kin to Elimelech and he could be the kinsman redeemer, but because he was following the laws of God. She could have ended up in another one, and they could have still been going back and getting every bit of it because they were not following God's laws at the time. So you see, it's key to even know what time period it's in so you see God's sovereign hand. And so today I want us to see 4 principles. If we're to receive a labor of love from God and we're to give a labor of love, then there's some things we have to be willing to do. And that's what I want us to see. And that first thing that we need to be willing to do in receiving that labor of love is this. We need to surrender to God's sovereignty. In the verses that we've already read this morning, we see an abundance of God's sovereign hand at work. And the first thing we see is his timing, his perfect timing. And that's the reason I started in that last verse of chapter 1, because what do we see there? They've come back. We've seen, all the problems that go on. We see that Naomi has become very bitter because of all the things that go on. But they came back to Bethlehem, back to Israel at the time of harvest. Perfect timing. The timing couldn't have been any better. And that's the way it always is with God's timing. His timing is perfect. And when we depend upon his sovereignty, it works out. We don't need to get ahead of it. We don't need to get behind him. We need to be on God's timing. So God had worked out the details in the life of Naomi for her to need to return to her homeland at such a time that there was a harvest of grain. It's not happenstance. When they returned, it was God's sovereign hand that returned them to Bethlehem at the time of the harvest of the grain, when it was fully ready. As believers, the best thing we can do is to wait upon the Lord's timing. Now, a lot of times we talk about waiting on the Lord's timing, and I can be honest with you, I've been there. Sometimes it's just you want to get ahead of God's timing because you don't want to wait around, That's a bad thing, because we get ahead of God's timing. Guess who's planning things? But when I wait on God, his time is always perfect. And I always give the example of when God called me to preach. It's only been 6 short years ago. And God called me to preach, and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm 52 years old. This is crazy, and why now? And all these types of things. But within a week's time, I had been approached twice about preaching, and I told nobody. Within a week's time, my job changed from Jefferson to Cornelia, closer to home. Within a week's time, my job changed such that I wasn't traveling all the time to where I was just traveling very little. All that stuff happened. And then I was called from here. And God called me here. His timing's perfect. And even though I might have wanted to be the full-time pastor and started preaching and all those things when I first came, again, God's timing was perfect. Did I get frustrated? Did I say, man, I'm ready to go? Sure I did. But God's timing is perfect. And we always need to wait on his timing. So we have the example here that God's timing again is perfect. And I will tell you, it don't matter if you're whether you're a pastor or you're a leader in the church, whoever you are, if you're a child of God, you must wait for God's timing in everything. His sovereign hand will lead you down the road, just like he led me down that road. And he led Ruth and Naomi and Boaz down that road because they trusted in his sovereign hand. If you've not experienced that wonderful timing of God, man, you need to as a Christian. It will fire you up. And again, I can just even use the example that I'm in Ruth, and we're talking about a labor of love on Veterans Day. And next week's about Thanksgiving. It's not happenstance. But second, we see that even in the evil time of the judges, that God had a man set aside who was faithful to the law of God and his purposes for that law. I mean, it says in that verse, it says she happened to show up at Boaz's field. Well, that happened don't mean happenstance there. It means God led her to that field. She was there for a purpose. Boaz was the man she was to meet. So we see that part as well of God taking his hand and leading her that way. He had a man who was faithful, and Boaz was a very unusual man during this time. How do we know that? He showed up at the field. He came out to the field where the reapers was gleaning. He really didn't have a reason he had to be there. He came out to that field, and look what he said to him. He says, what? I'm looking. I want to make sure I say it right. He said, the Lord be with you. The Lord be with you. Now, I guarantee you, they wasn't all those other fields. They didn't have the guy that owned the field come out to the reaper and say, hey, the Lord be with you. He was all about God and what God's law was and what God's purposes was in his life. And he wanted to share that with everybody that was in his life. So he went out to those people who were the reapers, those people. And these people were at this time, they were like not just some hired hand. They were almost considered a part of the family because he had to depend upon them to gather up that grain. And that was their livelihood. We're talking about their full livelihood. And in response, they said to him, and the Lord bless you. So you see, they had this great friendship between him and his reapers. So we see that here's this very unusual man that God led Ruth to. But not only that, here's a very unusual man that God was using for his purposes. And so here was Boaz who followed God and followed God's sovereignty. And he realized that he needed to be at the field that day. So we see that. God had led Boaz to live by the laws and do exactly what he needed to do at the right time in our story. God also had allowed Ruth to learn from the Levitical law. She asked Naomi, hey, let me go out and glean from the fields. Gleaning was exactly that law of coming behind the reapers. And remember, there was two things they couldn't do. They had to stay away from the corners of the field. And they couldn't just go through and, hey, they could have very well went back and been doubly sure that they got everything. Because grain was an important part to them. But they couldn't go back. If they had skipped some part, it laid there. And it laid there for those who were in need. That was the law. And so they abided by that law. His reapers abided by that law. I'm sure that Boaz said, now, don't forget the Levitical law. Do not forget the law of God. You leave those corners of that field and do not back up and pick something that's fallen to the ground. You keep going. So that was sovereign in God's hand, that here was a guy, and Ruth understood the Levitical law. Why did she understand the Levitical law? Naomi had taught it to her. Naomi had taught it to her. So Naomi teaching her that, she comes to Naomi and she says, hey, can I go out? And we begin to see a softening in Naomi's heart, because what does she say? Go, my daughter. She is kind of finally taken her own, realizing she is committed. She's going to stay there. Even though I may have pitched a pity party and talked about how bitter I was, Ruth's still hanging in there. And she's even asking me about going out and taking care of our food situation. So she tells her to go, my daughter. But more than that, she even says, hey, I need you to pray about where I'm going to land today. I need you to pray about that. So she's starting to teach Naomi to go back to those laws, to go back to the way that she needed to go back. Because she said, pray I find a place that will show me favor. Because she realized the time period they lived in, she might not just necessarily get that. So it was sovereign that Naomi had taught her these laws. It was no mistake that it was the time of the harvest. It was no mistake that Ruth knew the law of gleaning. It was no mistake that she stopped in the land of Boaz. It was no mistake that Boaz seen and asked about this stranger who was gleaning. And it was no mistake that Ruth was willing to provide for Naomi. You see, when we surrender to the sovereignty of God, we receive an amazing blessing from Him and His amazing timing. So that's the first thing we see in this labor of love, is that God's labor of love is that if we follow Him, He will bless us. He will bless us. And then the second thing we see in this is that we need to receive that labor of love. We need to cultivate a character of kindness. And we see these in the next 4 verses. Let me read those to you real quick. In verse 2, 8 through 12. Then Boaz said to Ruth, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from the young men, from what the young men have drawn. So she fell on her face, bowed to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? And Boaz answered and said to her, it has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother in the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward will be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. In these verses, we see the great kindness of both Boaz and of Ruth. Boaz showed tremendous kindness by asking Ruth to hang out with his own maidservants, and to stay and to glean only from his field. Better yet, he had placed a hedge of protection around her. He says, hey, I've instructed these men not to touch you. Not to touch you at all. So he placed protection around her. He goes as far as to allow her to drink from the supply of the water drawn for his own laborers. That's a big deal right there. Big deal. Boaz was, in a sense, taking her into his own household of those for whom he cared for. Ruth was amazed by his kindness and asked why was he showing such great favor, especially as a poor gleaner who was a foreigner. You know, I believe at this point she realized God had answered her prayer. Maybe she even thought, hey, Naomi must be back at the house praying for me, because God's answered my prayer. But you see, kindness is contagious, because why was Boaz so kind to her? When he answered, what did he say? He said, because of your kindness to Naomi. You committed to her. Not only have you committed to her, you've followed through. You're out here gleaning. You're out here trying to provide for her, just as the law has said that you're to do. And because of that kindness, instead instead, here comes Boaz to show his kindness to her. Because you see, Naomi was a close relative. Here was somebody taking care of her. As the Levitical law said, from the family. You know, it's key importance. If we read our Bible, we find how to take care of people. First and foremost should be from our families, the Bible teaches us. Then it teaches us there's ways that we can do that. And as believers today, we should be a part of that. We should definitely take care of our own families, but not only that, we should take care of those that surround us. It's an important law. But notice, she didn't sit at home and wait for him to bring her grain. She went out in the field and labored. God blesses laborers. It tells us that in Proverbs. He blesses those who's willing to work and work for what they have. Today we forgot those laws. They're important laws that we need to teach our children. Yet again, that God expects us to labor for those things. So she was willing to. And notice it says, man, she's been out here all day long. She finally took a rest in the house, but she's been after it all day long. The workers had told Boaz. So you see, because of her kindness, Boaz in turn shows her kindness back. You know, kindness to others never goes unrewarded. It never goes unrewarded. See, she was kind to Naomi, so she was getting kindness in return. It's contagious. I always think about the commercials or even the movies that are based around this pay it forward thing. You know, there was a movie, Pay It Forward. We have these commercials where it shows somebody doing something, somebody sees that, and what they do. Well, then they go out there to go show kindness to somebody else. I mean, the sad part is that surprises us in a commercial. It should be a normal routine of our daily lives, and we shouldn't have to. A theme about that in a movie should be, oh, well, everybody does that. What it really should be. It shouldn't be a point of marketing. It should be what we do every day. But I think about those things because that's what we see in kindness. When you show kindness, people recognize it, and it's contagious, and they want to show someone else kindness. And that's what we're seeing here. Passing it along. Boaz also realized that Ruth was not just showing kindness to Naomi, but she was also following the laws of God and living alongside God's chosen people. He realized that she hadn't just started showing kindness to Naomi, but she began to follow the laws of the Israelite people, the nation of God. You see, kindness brings God's blessing. And the fact that she chose wisely to follow and do God's laws where Orpah did not, she gets blessed for what she's done. Kindness, though, must be cultivated. It can't just, you can't say, I'm going to show kindness today. No, it's got to be cultivated. Sometimes it's not a normal thing. We don't, our kids don't grow up showing kindness. We kind of have to teach them kindness. And as we grow, we have to continue to learn. It's a cultivation thing. But as you do it, it becomes that fruit of the Spirit that you use over and over again. It's something that God tells us we must do if we're to bear fruit. It's that fruit of kindness. And that means sometimes our lives are all crusty and we don't want to be kind. So you got to break up the ground. When you go out and plant your garden, do you just sow the seeds right on top of the old hard, crusty ground? No. We even have a parable about that. It falls on the crusty ground and it don't do anything. Right? It springs up and it wilts away. You have to get the rocks out of the garden. You have to get those things out of the way. You have to cultivate in order to get those seeds deep. And that's what has happened here. They've removed the weeds. And once those seeds take root, they begin to bring forth fruit of kindness. And we begin to reap what we sow. We reap what we sow. And that's what's happening to Naomi. She's reaping, which is kind of neat because she is reaping. But she's reaping what she sowed in kindness. She's reaping it back. What a beautiful picture we see here in allowing God's kindness to overflow out of us to others. Kindness brings a labor of love from God. It brings blessings. The rest of the chapter shows us the rewards of our own labor and love towards others. First, we see that when we are willing to humble ourselves and serve and give kindness to others, then we receive an extra measure of blessing. An extra measure of blessing. Because of the kindness of Ruth was shown to Naomi, a relative of Boaz. Now Boaz in turn began to treat Ruth as a relative in turn. Treated her as a relative. It was not just what Boaz had heard, but now it's because Boaz has seen with his own eyes. She also showed that she was thankful to God for providing for her in his laws by working the fields as a good servant. She was working them. And what we see here is that it was due to the love of labor unto Naomi. So now she starts receiving more blessings. I want you to see what Boaz did here. He allowed her to come in and eat with him. And she was able to eat the bread with him and the servants who were working the field. She considered her just like one of the reapers, providing a meal, asking her to take it until she was satisfied. And then he told the others, hey, look, when y'all are reaping, y'all act like you're not good reapers and let some sheaves fall to the ground so she can pick up some extra. And so when she left that day, and notice what she did. She didn't just pick up the grain. She had to winnow it out. She had to do the work to get it down to what it needed to be to cook into bread. So she was willing to do that work too. And it says she had an ephod, a full ephod. And that was probably unheard of in just one day's gleaning. It provided for more than a week. She was probably expecting to get a couple of days provision. But instead she got a week's worth in that one day. And God sets an extra measure of blessing on us when we show kindness to others. You think today I'm not being blessed? Well, guess what? Bless someone else, and God will in turn bless you. But I want us to hit on our last thing that we receive, and that's this. We receive that extra measure of blessing, but we are to give it to others. We're to share that blessing with others, and we see such a beautiful example. Look at that last part of that chapter, verses 18 through 23. Then she took it and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she brought out and gave to her what she had held back after she had been satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, where have you gleaned today, and where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she worked, and she said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. And Naomi said to her, this man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives. Ruth the Moabitess said, he also said to me, you shall stay close to the young men until they have finished all the harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with the young women, and that the people do not meet you in any other field. So stay close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest and wheat harvest. And she dwelt with her mother-in-law. Ruth could not wait to get back home. And there's something you don't pick up on unless you read it real close. Notice she was there in the tent, and she was there eating with the reapers. And he said, have till you're satisfied. And she ate till she was satisfied, but she probably hadn't eaten a lot like that in a long time. So what could she have done? She would have done like many of us do when we hadn't eaten in a long time. We usually overeat. You know, when it's available to us, you know. I know when me and Connie go on a cruise, you know, we try to diet beforehand because we know we got all that good food and we're going to take as much of it as we can, right? Ruth could have done that. But notice what it said. It said she ate till she was satisfied, just till she was full, and then she took and put some back. And you don't know what it's talking about when you first read that. She's thinking, oh, well, she's keeping some for another day just in case. But no. She immediately goes home, and the first thing she does is, here, Naomi, take what I had today. She took from the best to give to Naomi. Folks, that's how we got to treat others. We don't hold back to some old sorry thing we have. We give to them what God's given to us. He's blessed us. We're to bless others. What a beautiful picture we see. And not only that, she gives that food for them both to live from. She's providing. What a special young lady. And she's excited and she's talking all about it. She was looking out for more than self. Ruth was not just looking out for herself, but for Naomi. And Naomi immediately became excited. Remember, she came into town. Everybody was excited. Just call me Mara. But now she's excited. She's beginning to see God's blessings back because why? She's returned to the land she should have been at. She's returned where she should be. Many times we stray from God because what happens? When we return to Him, we begin to see the blessings again. And that's what she's seeing. So she becomes excited for Ruth. For Ruth. Who was this person? Guess what? God led you exactly to who He needed to. A close relative of Elimelech. And you do what exactly He says. You just stay in His field because you don't need to meet any other men. This is the guy. So she's beginning now to teach again to Ruth. Folks, we may have gotten away from God, but when we get back, He begins to bless us. And not only that, we can begin again to bless others. So now, Naomi has in turn started blessing Ruth by telling her, you stay there. And we'll find out in the next chapter, even giving her instructions on what she needs to do. You see, we need to be all about the sovereignty of God. And trust His timing. Trust His hand, not our own. We want to do that. I want to do it every day too. I have to stop and think. God's sovereign. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. He does. And not only that, then I have to cultivate this kindness because, you see, Jesus Christ showed us the best labor of love and died on the cross for us. And we're to do what we can do to others, and that's through kindness. And folks, we don't get it naturally. We have to work on kindness. But then we see that when we do that, God gives us an extra measure of blessing. But we can't hold on to that blessing. We have to share it. And we share from the best of it. It goes back to the Old Testament principle of first fruits. We have to share from our first fruits. We don't just share what little bit we got left over. No, we intentionally put back just like Ruth did so she could bless Naomi with that same food she took up. Folks, that's what we need to do as believers. And you see, that's the picture we see from those who's willing to go serve in the army, willing to go serve in the military branches, and willing to lay down their life. We see that same picture. Folks, we ought to be thankful unto them, and we ought to honor them because of their service. You see how this so ties in on this Veterans Day? They blessed us by going and serving. We need to bless them back. Folks, God blessed us by giving Jesus Christ to us. We need to, in turn, bless others by sharing the gospel message so they, too, can have eternity in heaven. So you see, today as we come to this time of invitation, I just want you to stop and think, are you trusting God's hand? You know, maybe today you can say, I've never trusted God's hand. I've never trusted His sovereignty. I've never given my life over to Him. Some of you may be in church all your life and you realize that, hey, I've just been playing a game because I just thought it was something you done, and you come along and you sang songs and you know, you just done the best you could. But no, it's more than that. It's putting everything into God's hand and letting Him lead you. And if you've never done that, today is a day you can come do that.
But maybe you've just been trying to do it on your own. You've trusted God, but you've kind of got away from just trusting Him in everything. Maybe that's you this morning. You just need to come down and, like Ruth, commit. Maybe you've been where Naomi is, and you've just been bitter. And people starting to show you kindness. It's time that you wake up and you in turn show kindness to others and leave the bitterness behind, as Naomi has begun to do here in this part of the book today. You see, she was the one who knew more and needed to be teaching. Maybe that's you this morning. You know more and you need to be discipling other people, but you're so caught up in yourself. Do as Naomi done and get excited and start sharing. Folks, when we receive a blessing, let's share it with others. And maybe that's something you hadn't done, and you need to come today and make a commitment to that. Or maybe you just need to come and say, I want to be a part of the family. I want to be sitting at the table with the rest of the people at First Baptist, and you want to join and be a part of that. I don't know where God's leading you, but as we sing a hymn of invitation, you allow the Holy Spirit to speak to you and respond to His timing. And guess what? We know His timing on this because He says today is the day of salvation. So it's not waiting till tomorrow. He says always, every day, transform your life and follow me. So you don't have to worry about His timing and a decision this morning. You can make it now as we sing.